Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well. So in this video, we are going to discuss bezel setting. A bezel is essentially a little cup that we create to solder onto our ring or whatever it is that we're doing. And then with pressure, we push the walls of that cup over and it holds that stone in place. Now, you don't have to set a stone. Bezel setting can be used to set pretty much anything. The whole idea behind creating a bezel is obviously we can't solder a stone to our piece of jewelry. So a bezel is essentially a cold connection. You could set a piece of plastic. You could set a piece of metal that you don't want to solder. I set a lot of coins when I was working as a bench jeweler. Bottle caps, I mean, you name it. If it's got basically a flat-ish side to it, you can set it. Now, on the subject of that flat side, what you're gonna see most is bezel setting a cabochon. Now, a cabochon is a stone that has a flat bottom to it. Okay, a faceted stone like a diamond has a pointed bottom to it. So we need to employ different techniques in order to set a cabochon. In order to set a diamond. To set a cabochon, you're basically creating a bezel. Most cabochons are going to have a similar structure to them, where essentially they have this flat bottom and then there is a curve on the top. Now, I brought out this really pretty piece of mother of pearl. It really doesn't have much of a curve, and that's fine. You don't really need to have a curved stone. But since I'm talking about cabochons, I'm just going to talk about the nature of cabochons. Sometimes they're very tall in proportion to the stone. Sometimes they're very flat, okay? Now, this little one, I don't know how well this is going to show up on the camera. This little cab has a real steep, flat side to it before it curves. And when we are creating our bezel, the height of that bezel is really important, okay? Obviously, if you're not high enough, you're not going to have enough material to grab a hold of that stone and be able to hold it in place. If you're too high, all we're going to see is bezel, okay? And so this is an example of a bezel that is way too tall. And see how it starts to come over this stone. I mean, the whole reason you're setting a stone on your piece is because it's pretty and we want to see as much of it as possible. So getting the height of that bezel wall is really, really important. And so the way that we get the height of our wall, and I'm going to do the demonstration with this stone. This is, I think, one of the ugliest stones I've ever seen in my life. Sorry, no offense, stone. It looks like some dried up ketchup. And I bought this stone when I was in graduate school, and I've been using the same two stones for this demonstration throughout my entire career, because I like to demonstrate really the ugliest ring you could possibly make, which is an ugly stone sitting on a boring bezel, sitting on a boring ring. There's no connection, there's no design in this ring whatsoever. So the structure of this stone, okay, it's pretty standard the way it's shaped, pretty proportionate. Basically, what I need to do with a pair of dividers, I need to measure the height of this stone. Okay. all right? And I want to catch that, and I know this isn't really showing up on the camera, but I want to catch that just as it begins to curve, okay? I don't want this to be taller than my stone, and I want to be able to catch the curve of that line. Now, before I go any further, I need to prepare my bezel material, okay? And so I strongly recommend that you, at the very least, you make the bezel wall out of sterling silver. There's a couple reasons you want to do that. The first is we're going to make this bezel extremely thin. We're going to take this piece of, this is a piece of 20 gauge sterling silver that I got at the bookstore. This 1" by 6" piece, it was $32, which may seem like a lot of money, but it's really not. You know, if one student in the class purchases a piece of silver, that would probably be enough silver for the entire class to do this project. You can cut little pieces off and sell it to all your peers and make all of your money back. Our bookstore sells 1 by 6" strips, and like I said, this one was $32. You know, that's the equivalent of a good case of beer. The bookstore also sells 1 by 3" strips. And so the reason that you want to make your bezel out of sterling silver is we use silver solder, right? And so if I make my bezel out of a different material than sterling silver, there's going to be a really noticeable white line on there. And sometimes it's kind of a bit of a glob. You know, we don't really sand the bezel wall down too far because it's already so thin. The most important reason, though, is sterling silver has a really nice balance of being malleable enough to be able to easily push this over the stone, but yet when you work this, it gets really nice and hard, okay? And so the act of setting the stone is going to really work harden this piece of silver, and it's going to make it really strong. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut a little chunk off of this. Like I said, this is 20 gauge. I need to cut a small piece off and then roll it down in the rolling mill. So I'm not even going to bother measuring, but I do want my cut to be nice and straight. So cut about that much off and roll it down in the rolling mill. So here I am over here at the rolling mill, and as I said, this piece of metal is about 20 gauge. And so I want to roll it down. Now, this is obviously not nearly long enough right now to go around my stone. I want this to be a strip of metal that goes completely around my stone. Like I said, I've been using the same stone over and over and over again, so I know that through the process of rolling this down, it's going to get a lot longer, and it will be long enough for me to use it for this purpose. So I'm going to start by setting the rolling mill. Back this up, and then I'm just going to start rolling this down. Now you really want to go in straight. You want to make sure you're holding that nice and straight. And then keep checking your thickness. I want to take this to somewhere between 24 and 26 gauge. Okay? I don't want to go thinner than 26. And anything thicker than 24 gauge, I'm just gonna have to work really hard to get it to do what I want. Okay. Now you may notice a curve, all right? That could be the cause or the result of two things. Either you're going in crooked or you're just in a spot in the middle of this where it's kind of flexing. So what you can do is you can flip this over without changing the thickness and roll it again. And that usually straighten things out. Okay, so right now I am at 26 gauge. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to anneal this. Now annealing silver, there's a couple little tricks to do. I'm over here at the soldering station, and one of the tricks to annealing silver is to coat that silver with flux. So I'm going to use a nice bushy flame. I'm going to heat this up until the flux is completely clear, very much like how it looks right before you're ready to solder. And so I'm going to heat this up, the flux will be clear, and then I'm not going to quench this silver. Silver has some different properties than kind of like copper or brass. You don't want to quench the silver because you could risk hardening it up again. I don't want a really sharp flame like that. I want to have a nice feathery bushy flame. So right now we're in the crusty stage of the flux. And now that flux is completely clear. If you do it right, you should almost see a little bit of a greenish tint to it. And so I'm going to take this now and I'm going to set it on a chunk of steel, like the bench vise, an anvil, the steel plate on your benches, and I'm just going to let it cool. It cools very quickly because it's a really small piece of metal. Okay, I don't even know if it's been a whole minute, but this is already cool to the touch, okay? Once it's cool to the touch, I can go ahead and put it in the pickle, get all that flux off of there, get it nice and clean, and now it'll be really nice and soft and easy for me to bend around my stone. It's really important that you anneal your silver after you roll it, because when you roll it through the rolling mill, you're really hardening that metal up. And you're just going to be fighting that hardness if you don't anneal it. My silver is now out of the pickle and dried off. So I'm going to take my divider. Once again, the divider has been set to the height of my stone. I know you can't see that on the camera, but if you hold the divider up and look really closely, I'm catching that stone just as it starts to curve. So I'm taking the set divider, and first I'm going to make sure I have a nice straight side. This piece of bezel wire has a little bit of a curve to it, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that curve, I think. Myself a nice straight line for this. Now, I don't recommend that you use your saw to cut this the strip of silver. It's rolled down so thin that even with a super tiny saw blade, it's still going to catch a lot. A much better tool to use is just a standard pair of scissors. You always want to make sure that the metal that you want to keep, the metal that you're using for this pair of scissors or shears, you always want to make sure it's on the left-hand side of the shear, because the metal that gets cut on the right-hand side of the shear gets pretty significantly distorted. So I'm just carefully following my line. Giving myself a nice straight line to go by. See how it really curlicues and distorts that metal? So I'm taking the divider and I'm just holding it along the edge, and I just scribe down and you probably can't see this because of the glare. It's actually hard to see just even without the camera, but I have a really nice scribed line that is the height of my bezel. So once again, I'm going to cut. Another reason I didn't mention to work with silver is it's really nice to work with. Silver is a great metal to cut, to solder, to cast. All right, so here's my piece of silver that I just cut. I need to give myself a nice perpendicular line on one side, okay? Then I'm going to get out my round nose pliers. If you have a really tiny stone, you could do the whole thing with the round nose pliers. This is not a tiny stone. I would actually consider this to be a little bit on the large side. So I can do a lot just by bending this with my hands. But in order to use the round nose pliers, I can just bend this around. Now, another tool that you're going to want to employ a lot is a mandrel, okay? Now, this is a big enough stone that the regular old ring mandrel will work just fine. But if your stone is smaller, we do have a selection of bezel mandrels. So this is a round bezel mandrel. We kind of have standard sizes here. We have an oval shaped bezel mandrel, and this is something that I want to point out that really drives me crazy. Don't ever clamp a tool in a vise where we need to work on that tool. There's little vise teeth now on this oval mandrel right here. And if anybody uses this mandrel in that spot, they're gonna translate those marks onto their bezel. Always clamp something in a vise on its handle. Everything in here has an established handle. Use it. So we have an oval mandrel. We have a square bezel mandrel. And we have a teardrop bezel mandrel, okay? I am going to actually bend this bezel a little bit tighter than I need to, because the metal always wants to spring open on you. Using the rawhide mallet to work this a little bit. And I'm just going to set it over my stone. And with a Sharpie, I'm going to mark where the end is. The end that I had cut, okay? Now when I go to cut this, I'm actually going to cut a little small. It's always easier to stretch a ring than it is to shrink it down, okay? And so to shrink this down, if I make this too big, I have to cut and remove a chunk and then put it back together. Stretching it is really easy. So maybe, I don't know, maybe a couple millimeters away from my mark. So I don't know if you can see that in the camera. This is my original mark, but this is where I'm actually going to cut. Nice and straight. And now I'm going to spend some time getting this to fit. It needs to hold together under its own pressure. Okay? If I take this over to the soldering area and start soldering it and it opens up, I need to stop. I can't adjust this while I'm soldering. Also, it's really important that those edges meet up perfectly. So as this thing comes around, you have the two edges that meet. They need to meet perfectly. They can't have a gap like this or like this. And they also can't be twisted from each other. They need to come together straight, and they need to come together perfectly. Okay, so I just took some time to do that. I have this all lined up. It looks pretty good. So now I'm going to take this over and solder it. Okay, I'm over here in the soldering area, and I really want you to pay attention to how I have this clamped in the cross-locking tweezers. Okay, you never want to clamp this in there like this, because as this gets hot, it'll just squish. So clamping it like this, where the cross-locking tweezers are going with the plane of the metal, is going to allow it to hold securely without distorting the metal. Now, this is a very small piece of metal, so it's going to take a really small flame. And this is one of the few instances where you could do this seam with medium if you wanted to. I still use hard because I use hard for everything, but this is one of those rare cases where you could start this with medium. So I'm going to put my flux on there. And I don't know how well this is going to show up on the camera, so hopefully you'll try it and we'll be able to work on it together. So like I said, really small flame. Okay, so that looks pretty good. It flowed. Now what you want to pay attention to is, if this is essentially a ring where you have two ends of the same piece of metal coming together. If all of your solder goes to one side, that means that side was a little too hot, or it was hotter than the other side. So what you would need to do is grab another piece of solder, stick it on the seam again, and focus your heat on the side where the solder didn't go. You need to get both sides heated evenly. So I'm going to put this in the pickle and get ready for the next step. I'm back here at the bench and I've gotten my bezel out of the pickle, and it's a little distorted, and you should expect that. So what I need to do first is I'm going to take my mandrel and I'm just going to fix that shape a little bit. Now I'm not hitting it with the rawhide just yet because I want to test fit it on my stone. Okay, good, and it's a little tight. So from here, now what I'm doing is I'm kind of tugging down with my pointer finger. As I hit, that's going to kind of stretch my bezel. And then you always go a little bit and then test fit, and then go a little bit and then test fit. So I know that I'm at the right size when I can take this bezel and push it completely through. The next thing I need to do is just to check the profile of this bezel. A lot of times the metal has a memory to it and it wants to kind of distort itself back to the shape that it wants to be in. You can't tell because the stone is going to be holding it into the correct shape. So the way to test that is to get a piece of paper, trace the stone, and set the bezel on there to make sure it's following the right profile. So here is the profile of my stone. Set that bezel on there and take a look. And this bezel wants to go a little oval on me. So I need to make sure now I'm not stretching it this time because I don't want that bezel to get too big. Now it's perfectly following that profile. This is a really important step the bigger your bezels get. Also, if you were bezel setting something really irregular, like if I was bezel setting this little 3D printed anvil and I wanted to follow that weird profile of the base of this anvil, I could bend my bezel to fit and then trace it and set that bezel down to make sure it's going to be the right size. And so I'm pretty comfortable with this. It's not too big, it's not too small. Obviously, if it's too small, you need to keep stretching it. If your bezel is too big, and you try to set it, you're going to have real problems because those walls are going to be too far away from your stone. So you're really going to have to push and you'll have a slanted bezel on one side. And it might be so slanted that it ends up not being tall enough to hold that stone into place. So it's really important to make sure that your bezel fits your stone perfectly. Now that it fits perfectly, I'm going to solder it down to whatever metal I'm using as the base of my bezel. So in this case, I'm just going to keep using the silver just because it's here. But you don't have to. You could use any metal for the bottom of the bezel. And sometimes something like nickel with its like slightly darker gray can be a nice subtle design element. I've cut out what's going to be the bottom of my bezel. And now I need to take my bezel and sand it so that I have a side that's flat. Since I brought that bezel wire all the way around, you know, it was slightly different thicknesses from end to end. And so there's a gap right at the solder seam. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a gap right at the solder seam that I need to get rid of. So I'm going to sand this a little bit After I sand, I'm going to double check to make sure it didn't get distorted, and then I'm going to set up for soldering. I'm back over here at the soldering area, and the setup is pretty important that you follow these instructions. So the first thing is I have everything set up on a cage. The reason why I'm on the cage is the metal that's on the bottom of my bezel cup is so much thicker and bigger in comparison to the bezel wall. So I need to be able to bounce the heat under this bezel to get it to solder. If I just heated from the top, that bezel wall would get hot very quickly and the solder would just flow to it. This next part is really important. Okay, so when I'm placing my solder on this seam, I need to make sure that I'm putting the solder around the outside of the bezel wall. I spent a long time getting this bezel to fit really snug around that stone. If I have solder bumps inside there, then the stone isn't going to fit. So I need to make sure that I don't have any solder on the inside of this bezel. And you need to pay attention too, because sometimes, you know, when you start heating and that flux is boiling and spitting solder all over the place, I've seen where pieces of solder have actually flown into the inside of that bezel. And if you don't catch that, you're going to have some problems. Okay, so I have my solder placed. Get my torch lit. Okay, so that solder's flowing. I'm watching the inside of my bezel cup because I want to make sure that I see solder the whole way around that. I don't want any gaps. Gaps are going to be a big problem with this. So that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to pickle and then on to the next step. I've got my bezel out of the pickle and I am inspecting around the solder seam to make sure I don't have any gaps or anything like that, and it looks pretty good. Now, before I go to test fit my stone, I need to drill a hole in this. If I did everything like I was supposed to, and if I go to try to test fit this stone, it's going to be extremely difficult to get that stone back out of there. This bezel, if I did everything right, should be really nice and tight around this stone. So if I don't have a hole in this, I'm going to have a lot of trouble getting that stone back out. Now you want to plan ahead. I'm just planning on taking this bezel and soldering it onto a really boring band. So I'm going to put that hole directly in the center so that when I solder it on here, we won't see it anymore. So nothing overly complex. Now I have a nice little hole and I can test fit my stone. Now I'm going to test fit my stone. Fits in there really nice and tight. And what I'm looking for is I'm looking to make sure that I have enough bezel that goes the whole way around this that I can push over, and it looks pretty good. I'm also checking to make sure if it's not too tall. At this stage, it's really easy to sand this down so that it's nice and even, adjust for the height and things like that. Now I have the slightest little gap right where the two ends of that bezel came together. And I need to make sure that's nice and even, because if I push over the metal, I'll never be able to adjust that. So I'm taking a few minutes here to do a little bit of sanding to get everything nice and even so that I don't have problems later. Test fit my bezel once again. Looks good. Okay, now I'm going to trim and I'm going to file. Now I'm being really careful to stay on the outside of my solder seam. I don't want to risk cutting into my bezel at all. Okay, I've left myself a little bit of metal to file away. Now if I just take this and put it in the ring clamp, I'm going to crush my bezel. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to put my stone back into the bezel, and now I can do my sanding and filing because the ring clamp is pressing against the stone and not pressing against the wall of the bezel. So you notice that I'm hitting this with my sanding stick too as I'm going around. I'm not going to get it completely sanded, but if I do a little preliminary sanding before I solder it down, it's going to make my life a little easier. Okay. So all that metal has been trimmed off. I have a nice flat bezel And now I'm ready to sweat solder this to my band, but I have to make sure I get the stone out first. I'm all set up over here in the soldering area to sweat solder my ring onto my bezel. Now I'm going to do all this in one step. You can easily split it up and do it into two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flow the solder onto the ring first, and then I'm going to take that ring, set it right on the center, and solder that ring down to the bezel. Now this is the spot where people usually melt their bezel, so you want to be very careful and really touchy with your heat. Okay, so I have successfully soldered my bezel to my ring. I'm going to quench, pickle, and then I'm going to actually set the stone. My ring is now out of the pickle, and it's time for me to kind of inspect, see what's going on. So it's actually a little crooked. When I was soldering this, apparently my hand was a little crooked. That would be something that I would normally fix. But since this is just for a demonstration, and I'm probably going to end up taking this bezel off to redo this demonstration later, I'm not really going to worry about it too much. Also, what I would normally do is I would do as much finish work on this as I can. A lot of cabochons are not very hard stones. I mean, this is turquoise. Turquoise is a very soft stone. I don't know what this gross orange stone is, but I would assume that most of these stones are going to be softer than the polishing compound. So if I wanted to put a high polish on my ring, I would want to do as much of that sanding and finishing and polishing as possible before I set my stone. Most of the time the polishing compound is made of corundum, which is essentially ruby, which is the second hardest stone on the hardness scale. So to set the actual stone, I'm going to start by clamping my ring in the ring clamp. Now, I like to use the flat side of the ring clamp and press the bezel right up against the ring clamp. And so then I'm going to take my stone and put my stone in there. Now, I have 3 different tools that I can use to set the stone. The first is our pusher. You basically hold the pusher like this. It has this blunt end, and you can use that to push the bezel down onto your stone. The pusher is really handy on corners if you have a square or a triangular stone and you want to get those corners folded over really nicely. Also, if you have really tough metal that you're using for your bezel, the pusher can be really handy. The next tool that I'm going to talk about is the burnisher. You could use the burnisher to basically push that bezel wall down. You would just go around and around and around with the burnisher. The burnisher is not a very efficient way to set the stone, but you will use the burnisher to finish, and I'll get to that in just a minute. What I prefer to use is a rocker, okay? And so basically with the rocker, you're gonna come at an angle, and you're just gonna rock this around that stone, and it really quickly pushes the bezel around the stone. So I'm going to hold against the bench. I'm going to hold this at an angle, and I'm just going to rock my way around this stone. Pushing that bezel nice and tight against the stone. Basically as tight as I can get it. So basically this stone is set now. Like I said, it's not finished. I still need to burnish, but I have pressed the wall of that bezel around my stone. Next, I'm going to take the burnisher, and if you pay attention to the profile of the burnisher, it's kind of an oval shape. And so that shape of that burnisher is going to allow me to get to the entire bezel. So I'm going to start by burnishing the top first. And I'm going to change the camera angle so I can use the bench pin just a little bit. So I'm going to burnish all around the top. And I'm using a pretty good amount of force to do this. And what you'll notice when you're burnishing is it really pushes that metal nice and tight. And I don't know if you can see this on the camera, but it's been burnished on this side at the very top, but not on this side. This metal looks a little thicker. This metal looks nice and thin and finished. So basically back and forth, a whole bunch of times. Now I'm accomplishing two things when I burnish. The burnisher is going to give the silver a really nice finish. It's a burnished finish is similar to a polished finish. Really nice and shiny if you do it nice and uniform. So if I hold the burnisher like this with it pitched out, I can get the bottom of the bezel. If I hold it pitched this direction, I can get the top of the bezel. But the more important thing that the burnisher is doing is I'm significantly work hardening the silver. Now making this silver as hard as it can be. That means it's making this bezel as strong as it can be. And if you recall me mentioning at the beginning of the video why I recommend silver for, at the very least, for your bezel wall, it's because you can really work harden that silver and really make sure that your stone setting is secure. No one wants to be responsible for when if that stone falls out of there. Now I've been burnishing for a while, and I still have a little bit more to do. But hopefully you can see in the camera, you can see the difference of the shiny areas up here at the top versus the not so shiny areas down here, the bottom of the bezel. I would continue to burnish around this, making it nice and uniform and hard.